Hello, everyone from New York. Thank you very much for joining us. We are continuing to discuss with you and educate and update on the various issues that unfortunately we have to face head on. One of the issues is a very painful one that we'll discuss today. It's our second program on Hamas gender violence against Israelis that we're all experiencing, and we believe is very important that the world take on and that international organizations take on seriously. This is also part of our effort to convey how serious the situation is, how it's not business as usual, how Israel needs the time and space to complete its goals of securing the South and making sure that there is no more Hamas and that there is no more threat to southern Israel. We also face similar challenges in the north, as you know, and the situation is not getting any better on this day 66. So without further ado, we will begin our program, but we just want to say to all of you, and you'll hear more about this in the coming days, that there is pressure on Israel to expedite, and there's growing calls for a ceasefire without the conditions that we believe and that Israel believes will be critical for its own future security. So this is a continuing challenge that we face, and we hope that European governments stand with Israel despite the pressure. And this is the mission of our organization that will continue to pursue in the coming months into the new year. So again, without further ado, Marta, our director in Central and Eastern Europe, the floor is yours to introduce our topic and our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Marta Kubica. I'm the CEO of FELNET in Central Eastern Europe. As you all well know, our mission is to bring Europe and Israel together, especially in such trying times. Since October 7, we brought to Israel almost 100 policymakers on solidarity missions. That's also in a very big in a very big part thanks to you. Policymakers want to come to Israel to learn, to speak up about the atrocities committed by Hamas, mostly on civilian Israeli population. There are still over 130 civilians held hostage in Gaza, including babies and elderly, and we hope and pray every day that they will come back home safely and swiftly. Even though the Hamas massacre was live streamed, we all remember horrible videos of girls being abducted, wearing clothes covered in blood. And the horrific videos are really easily available online. Many voices in the world are either doubting the events of October 7 or completely forgetting Israeli women. That's why we created this event. This is already, as David mentioned, a second one, and we will talk more about this issue to shed light and expose the crimes committed by Hamas on Israeli women and girls on October 7 and afterwards. Our intention was to host the first event as a part of worldwide events surrounding the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which was established by the UN on October 25th. It took the same UN nearly 60 days to finally condemn Hamas. Before we start our event, I would like to warn you that some of the content discussed might be very graphic and disturbing, and I would suggest that at any point if necessary, you can just put the Zoom on silent. We're very lucky to be hosting today's speaker, Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari. Let me just give a brief introduction to our amazing guest today. It's really an honor to be moderating this call tonight. Professor Ruth Halperin-Kaddari is an expert on family law and international women's rights and is the founding director of the Rachman Center for the Advancement of Status of Women at Bar Ilan University Law Faculty in Israel, where she serves as an associate professor. She's also a former member and vice president of the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Form of Discriminations Against Women, during which she was the first chair of the Working Group on Inquiries. A graduate of Yale Law School, she has published extensively in her area of expertise, including a book of women in Israel through the University of Pennsylvania Press. Additionally, Professor Halperin-Kaddari served for 5 years in the national role as the chair of the advisory committee to the Authority of the Advancement of Women at the Prime Minister's Office. Professor Kaddari, thank you so much for joining us. And let me open with 2 questions. First, was the gender violence perpetrated by Hamas just a sheer cruelty committed in the rage of the moment, or was it planned to be executed that way? And if you can follow up with telling us what has been the biggest challenge for experts, especially given that most of the victims are unable to say what happened to them, and what can be done for the living, I wouldn't say victims, but also victims and
survivors.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here today. And I really appreciate your paying attention to this critical element of the massacre of October 7th, the attack of Hamas on Israel on October 7th. I want to clarify that all the information that I'm giving to you tonight is based on investigation materials that I have access to directly from the police or from the IDF, from Israeli security services. It is an unusual way of engagement, of having formal authorities give access to civil society, but as an academic with international standing, I was asked to brief the Security Council by the by the American mission to the United Nations. Eventually, it did not happen because the Chinese blocked it, but Israeli authorities realized that myself and perhaps others occupy a very unique position in terms of engagement with the world, with leaders, with the world, the international public opinion, and specifically serving as briefing ambassadors, policymakers. I traveled also to Geneva 2 weeks ago to meet with high officials at the Human Rights Council, including the High Commissioner on Human Rights. I have to be in a position that I can provide information which I know that is verified and credible and coming directly from the investigation and not hearsay or just reporting what has been reported in the media. So I will repeat here what I said 2 weeks ago at the UN in Geneva when I briefed ambassadors, the diplomatic community there. I present the case which I call connecting the dots. And while you're right, part of the plan of Hamas was to silence the victims forever by killing them immediately after performing the atrocities that included sexual violence against them. We do not have at present surviving I have no choice but to use the word victim here. Although there are survivors who had endured rape or other forms of sexual violence. And I know that through inquiring with colleagues who work in the area of providing care and treatment to rape survivors, so including rape crisis centers or individual private therapists. These survivors, those few, are not speaking yet. They have not stepped forward to the police or to Israeli authorities. It is very understandable. Even in regular, quote unquote, circumstances of sexual assaults or rape, survivors are very slow to open up and to step forward, even to bring charges. All the more so when the sexual assault was part of a horrific terror attack, and when the survivors had actually been in immediate life-threatening situation. So the trauma here is really unimaginable. And I don't even know if we have reason to think that they will ever be willing to speak up, to step forward, to speak up. We have reason to believe that of those who survived the attack, many had also been taken hostages. We pray, and we're doing everything possible to have them, to bring them back home in full, alive. But until they come back, again, there is no way of hearing from them. But what do we have? We have eyewitness account of a survivor who hid in the bushes and describes in very graphic details the gang rape that took place not far from where she hid. That gang rape included an extreme form of mutilation of the woman who was raped while she was still alive. I prefer not to describe the very graphic details of the mutilation, but I will say that the account given by the eyewitness, and I watched her taped testimony given to the police at the investigation, the details are extremely graphic and detailed. And she describes that after the mutilation and the rape by several men, the last man shot the woman in her head while he was still raping her. That eyewitness also recounts another scene where another man was carrying the body of a naked woman on his shoulder. That eyewitness was taken by the police a couple of weeks ago to the area of where the Nova Music Festival took place. That is, she's a survivor of the Nova Music Festival, where she pointed to the place in which she hid, the bushes in which she hid, and located the place where the rape happened. And the police found items, personal items in that spot, which of course corroborates her testimony. Now, there are footage of Hamas tapes that, as you rightly said, they had actually filmed, and they came equipped with the body cameras to broadcast all the atrocities that they committed in real time to the whole world, to the families of the victims through the phones, through the mobile phones of the victims, that this was part of the cruel plan which they which they had in advance. So there are thousands and thousands of hours of digital evidence, videos, and you asked about the challenges of this investigation. This is, of course, one of the huge challenges of the most complicated and largest criminal investigation ever in Israel's history. I was shown several films and photographs that were taken from the phones or from property of Hamas terrorists that were captured by Israeli forces. These films depict, for instance, the group of young women who were all brought to a shelter, and they all exhibited signs of sexual assaults by the blood, large areas of blooded clothes in the lower parts of their bodies, and again exhibiting signs of being exposed to sexual assaults. I was shown a photograph that that depicts very clear sexual assault of a woman whose pants are being lowered, and men on her. I was shown photographs of and footage taken by first responders who arrived to the area, who filmed or photographed the bodies that were found in several locations. And it's very important to emphasize this point that we're talking about several locations with the same pattern of evidence found of bodies of women with either no clothes or no clothes of the lower parts of their bodies, bleeding from the lower part of the body in positions that, to borrow a phrase by a police officer, the bodies speak. The bodies leave no doubt as to what endured, what took place either just before or just after they had been shot. This matches the accounts, the oral accounts by the first responders. This also matches the oral account of the people who worked, still work at the Shura military base, which was turned into a morgue. Maybe some of you have already heard the account by Sherry, who's a reservist in the army, and whose task was to identify the female soldiers whose bodies were brought to the base. And she also described bodies coming with only their underwear or on or torn underwear, bleeding and showing signs of mutilation and of shots, either in the area of the genital or the area of the breast. And again, this repeats the description of the first responders in various locations. And this all amounts to a clear picture of a systemic method that was exercised by Hamas terrorists. The same pattern, the same unbelievable degree of cruelty beyond human imagination, all done at the same time. It could not have been had there not been a premeditated plan to use sexual violence as a tool of war, as a weapon of war in this particular attack by Hamas. And to this, we should add the statements already given by several Hamas terrorists as part of their interrogation by Israeli security services, who describe the orders and the instructions that they were given prior to the attack to enter, to capture, and to torture, and to rape women and children and teenagers. And when asked about the religious prohibition of engaging in such atrocities, they refer to a general religious dispensation that permits them to commit all these crimes, which in principle go against Islamic teaching. So I am totally convinced that the case to make that Hamas attack, including its usage of sexual violence during this attack, it fits the definition of crimes against humanity, possibly also genocidal rape, because when added to the charter of Hamas, which clearly and specifically orders the annihilation of the Jewish people in the state of Israel, this could also add to the genocidal aspect of the crime against humanity, bringing it to the highest charge in international criminal law.
Thank you. I would like to ask you, at what point did you and other experts realize the scope of the sexual crimes committed on October 7th? And I was wondering whether the Israeli mental health system is equipped to deal with this amount of personal and collective trauma.
I can talk about myself. Already on the Sunday after October 7, it was clear to me when I realized that Hamas terrorists actually had the opportunity of operating uninterrupted for many, many hours in several Israeli villages, places in the south. Based on my experience on the CEDAW committee, based on things that I read, based on what I heard from women who had been survivors of armed conflicts in other places in the world, it was clear to me that sexual violence was part of the massacre of October 7th. But what I could not have imagined is the degree of extreme cruelty and barbarity that was also part of the sexual violence. And it was also clear to me that probably this realization is not yet part of the awareness of Israeli authorities, whether of the investigative teams or the providers of health, of care, of rehabilitation of the survivors. This had never been part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before, at least not since the establishment of the State of Israel. It was not part of the protocol for instance, for asking those who are admitted to hospitals. It's not something that you ask a survivor of a terror attack, at least until October 7. Unfortunately, from now on, of course, it will be part of the protocol. But there was an urgent need from civil society, from my colleagues who are more experts in provision of care for sexual assault survivors, from the therapeutic professions, from the healthcare professions, victimology. There was urgent need to approach Israeli authorities and to offer our expertise and our experience. And I have to say with gratitude that, just as I indicated before, it's not usual for such a collaboration, for such a cooperation, for the formal establishment to actually open its doors and receive the help and the advice. But this is definitely what has taken place and still is taking place in Israel's dealing with the aftermath of this unimaginable, unprecedented massacre attack of Hamas on October 7th.
Thank you. I would like to ask you one more question before we move to Q&A from our audience. Can we shortly talk about the UN? First of all, how can we explain that everyone at the UN, all the way up to the Secretary General, are urging Israel to abide by international law, but not granting Israelis the protection of the international law? That's one thing. And second, is there actually anyone left to work with at the UN at this point, or this is a lost cause?
I will start with the second question, because a very important development, in my view, had taken place just this past weekend, when the special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence in times of conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, had issued a very, very strong statement, the strongest to date in as far as I have seen, condemning Hamas, expressing grave concern in light of the reports of the returning hostages about the ongoing sexual assault that was exercised on both men and women in captivity, and demanding the immediate release of all hostages, and expressing her willingness and her acceptance of the formal invitation by Israel to conduct a visit here, to meet with survivors, with victims, with the authorities. And she explicitly uses the phrase, to be the voice of the victims, to be the voice of those who had been silenced forever. So if you ask if there is anybody to work with, yes, I believe that there is, starting with Ms. Patten and hopefully moving on with others. I refuse to give up on the international human rights mechanisms and bodies, although I do see their silence, their long silence, the long time that it took them to gear up, to step up. I see this as a huge failure of the system, but we have no choice but to work for the amendment of the system, for fixing the system, for talking about the failure and for demanding the redress. And we started as early as October 8 and 9 with letters to the CEDAW committee, which I was part of in the last decade. I wrote an email, sent an email with a letter describing October 7th, describing the sexual violence that was part of the attack, together with a colleague, Professor Francis Radai from the Hebrew University. We sent it to CEDAW, to the CRC, to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, to the Special Rapporteur on Enforced Disappearances, to UN Women, and we demanded from all of them to acknowledge and to recognize that what took place on October 7th was crimes against humanity, that Hamas engaged in the worst kind of using rape and using sexual violence as a weapon of war against all international law, of course, beyond anything recognized in humanitarian law. And we expected them to issue statements to that effect. And as you just described, the response was very, very disappointing. None of these international human rights bodies, in fact, referred to sexual violence or acknowledged the sexual violence was part of the attack until the beginning of December, when a couple of days after the Secretary General Guterres had no choice but to acknowledge that there are increasing reports concerning increasing reports of sexual violence that was part of the attack, and saying that this must be rigorously investigated. And then UN Women joined in. After he cleared the path, UN Women joined in and repeated these concerns. I should say that the head of UN Women in Geneva already did issue, well, not a statement, but in the event of that opened the 16 days of fighting violence against women on November 25th, she did refer to the sexual violence that took place in the Hamas attack on October 7th, and she put it in one line with previous cases of the use of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war in recent history, ranging from Ethiopia to Sudan to DRC to Syria to Rwanda and to Ukraine, as is happening even as we speak. So she already did acknowledge that, but the leadership of UN Women in New York refrained from that until 10 days ago. It took them almost 2 full months. And as I said, it's a failure, but this does not mean that it's a lost cause. I believe it is changing now, and it is changing a lot through all our concerted efforts and through international media, which slowly but has picked up the issue in recent weeks.
So I will ask one more question. What do you think is needed next, and what can we do in Europe? There is many high-level politicians, men and women alike, speaking up, trying to raise the issue. we ourselves are actually working on a briefing at the Polish Senate of bringing some speakers from Israel to do a press conference, and I know that other FELNET offices will do the same. What can we, first of all, as FELNET, but also as Europeans and people who are working with European policymakers and influencers and organizations, what can we do in order to, first of all, raise awareness, and then what's needed next after people already know about the issue?
There's a lot that can be done, and I will distinguish between two levels of engagement, of operation, the public opinion level and then the political level. On the public opinion level, we are in the midst of a campaign of denial, which started as early as October 8th. We mentioned that October 7th was probably the most recorded international crime in history, but immediately afterwards, perhaps when Hamas realized that it actually does them disservice, they started erasing all those videos, and they engaged in the most sinister denial campaign together with their allies. The New York Times investigation showed the clear connections and the involvement of China and of Russia in this campaign of denial, and they are succeeding. And the battleground, forgive me for using this militaristic term, but the battleground for this campaign is social media. And that's where each and everyone can become an activist. And I call upon, it's not for governments to do the work of civil society, but policymakers, influencers can definitely push for more involvement by everybody to combat this denial, to deny the denial. Then on the political level, there still are too many countries in the world, also in the global north, in developed countries, democracies, that still do not recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. As we know, the UN itself does not recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. And this must be changed. The whole free world must unite as one, just as it united against ISIS, to designate Hamas, to call it for what it is, a terrorist organization of the worst kind, the largest threat for world peace and security. And the whole free world must use everything in its powers, economic powers, political powers, go against the allies of Hamas, use sanctions, and as I said, call for its designation as a terrorist organization. It must be eradicated from the face of earth. And Israel's military engagement is certainly not the only way to do it. At present, Israel had no choice but to engage in the military operation. But I myself, I do share the concerns for the devastation, for the sufferings of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza. I see them as victims too. They must also be freed of Hamas, because Hamas is committing war crimes against them as well, by using them as human shields, by hiding beneath them. It is not just an issue for Israel. It is an issue for the whole world.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open the floor so you can ask our guest a couple of questions. I know we have a question from Zoreg Mizrahi. Can you please turn on your, yes. Go ahead. The floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Professor Kaddari, thank you so much for your participation in this briefing. And I really want to thank FELNET leadership for inviting you to speak the words that unfortunately we are unable to express. And thank you for your service. One thing that is troubling, and I think to a great degree you did answer my question, but I want to go back to the issue that while we see amazing organizations like FELNET and many other activists speaking for Israel and on behalf of Israelis, where are we going wrong? What are we doing wrong? Not advocating enough for the women that have been raped and are still held in captivity by the terrorists. What can we do to change this perspective? And what can the American Jewish organizations do in this country to change that entire narrative? Thank you so much.
I think we should bear in mind that this battle is not just in the name of Israel, and it is not related to the politics or where a person stands in terms of Israel's current war in Gaza, engagement in Gaza. It is a battle for humanity as a whole. When I spoke, when I met with the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva, I came not just as an Israeli, I came as an expert in international human rights, speaking for women and for children and of men of the whole world. And I demanded that the international human rights community speaks not just for the sake of those women in Israel, but to realize the mission of protection of human rights throughout the world. Because by keeping silence and by not realizing their mission, by not doing their job, they have failed not just us, they have failed the whole humanity. They have failed the whole human rights system. They sent a message that these atrocities can be committed and can be viewed by some as a legitimate form of resistance, of freedom fighters. Then what would keep the next terrorists and the next terrorist organization or Hamas in other places in the world? What would keep them from repeating it and from doing it if the human rights system fails to act, fails to operate? So I think that the message should be taken in isolation from what Israel does or does not do in Gaza. I do not see myself as a spokesperson for Israel's government. I am not government. I am a human rights advocate. I am a law professor believing in human rights, in women's rights, an activist in human rights. And this is the message that I'm coming with.
Thank you so much. We have one more question from Dan Gruen. Dan, are you ready to ask your question now? The floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yes. My question was specifically that knowing, as you said, that there are still hostages who are being mistreated in these and very likely other ways, should more pressure from the international community be put on the International Red Cross to vehemently demand to visit the hostages. I think, Hamas will likely refuse, but at least the world will see that Hamas refuses, and it will help counter the narrative that the hostages are being treated with some sort of form of lovely Islamic hospitality. So should more pressure be put on the International Red Cross?
Yes. Well, thank you for the question. The situation of the hostages, those who are still left there, more than 130, I think 138 hostages, including a group of 17 young women who we just heard last week, the concerns by the spokesperson of the State Department that Hamas' refusal to release them together with the other women is because of what they had endured and for not wanting them to speak about it. The concern is that they might engage in attempts to silence them forever, just as they did all the victims on October 7. Definitely more pressure. The president of the ICRC, of the Red Cross, is visiting Israel this week on Wednesday for 3 days. She will be accompanied by our ambassador to the UN in Geneva, Ambassador Meirav Ilon Shachar, and she will meet with families of the hostages, those who are still there and those who returned. And I very, very much hope that this will be a point of change in the attempts to release all the hostages. But it's not just the ICRC. No, well, so many things are happening. Just yesterday, on Sunday, the World Health Organization convened an exceptional session on Sunday, which is very, very unusual, in Geneva, releasing a statement expressing grave concern for the fate, for the humanitarian condition of women and children and civilians in Gaza. And again, I do not argue that their condition is indeed harrowing. But there was no one word mentioning the hostages in the official statement by the World Health Organization in Geneva. This is just, it is so unacceptable. It is so unimaginable. It is, again, a total failure of this particular organization. So pressure should go to all organizations, not just the Red Cross, to the WHO, to UNICEF, to a range of other organizations. It's the responsibility of each and every policymaker in their own vicinity to see which organizations, where work must still be done, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Thank you so much. I have one more question before we move to Joan Ryan, our CEO in the United Kingdom. Dr. Halperin-Kaddari, do you believe that the victims will ever find their justice? And if so, how do you envision it?
There are numerous venues for bringing justice here. First of all, the investigation, the criminal proceedings that will take place in Israel. As I said, and as I emphasized, I'm not part of the government. I'm not in the Ministry of Justice, but I am involved with everything that takes place there. And I know that there are still debates going on how exactly to handle bringing to trial and hopefully convicting 200 Hamas terrorists who are currently held by Israel. It's very unlikely that, it seems almost impossible to handle separately 200 separate criminal trials. I know that from the legal perspective, options are being examined to establish the case, just as I described in the beginning of our talk, establish the case of the joint premeditation, plan, intention, purpose, in American terms, conspiracy, that all these terrorists were part of. They entered Israel knowingly that they are going to kill, that they are going to torture, that they are going to use all those atrocious things that they committed, and to murder. And so there is the possibility of collectively charging them. There are other venues. Once the crime, the definition of crime against humanity is established, this is a cause for international jurisdiction, for universal jurisdiction in several countries who can issue international warrants. Similarly, the ICC can do that. And the prosecutor, the special prosecutor of the ICC, Mr. Karim Khan, actually visited Israel last Friday. It was a personal visit. He was invited by the families, the forum of the families, of the hostages' families. And he already announced that the attack of October 7th is part of his jurisdiction of the investigation of all alleged war crimes that allegedly take place in Israel or in the OPTs. So that is another venue. And I personally work on the arena of having international independent investigation by either UN bodies, including, for example, what I really hope the upcoming visit of Ms. Pramila Patten, but also other bodies, because this is a different legal sphere than criminal proceedings. The burden of proof, of course, is totally different. It is not bringing charges against individuals. It is, if you like, it is for the historical justice. It is for the historical acknowledgement. Just like I mentioned before, the head of the UN Women in Geneva, just like she said that in the same line of Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, Ukraine just now, there is also Re'im and Be'eri and Nachal Oz, all those villages in the southern part of Israel, they're on the same line, and Hamas is responsible for that. And this international recognition, I think, is also a crucial form of doing justice in this case.
Thank you. I believe we have time for one last question, and it's going to be Tom Flesch, our chairman-elect of the Friends of FELNET. Tom is in LA. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for giving me this opportunity to ask this question. I want to say to you, thank you so much for your presentation. Your approach is so balanced and so credible that it's very difficult for, at least for me, to even challenge make any kind of challenge to the case for women's rights that are human rights. and that the education is so vitally important. My question is, though, is that we understand this, and at least in our religion and the way we approach things, women's rights are human rights, and the value of the human being is so paramount and more important, and it's always taken into consideration in decisions and in the way of life, the way we live. But I live in California, United States, and just recently as last week, we had representatives of major universities speak to the subject of human rights, women's rights, free speech, actionable violations of free speech. And quite frankly, these pillars in our American society, or at least in the education system, failed to a great degree in advocating human rights. And we see this now in our universities in America. We see it at the UN, and we see it in many European countries as well. And it seems that if it's the Israelis that are advocating the position, as opposed to non-Israelis, it's not heard. It's not heard enough to cause action, and enough people to step up and say enough is enough. We have to recognize people as equals and protect human rights. What more should we do? What kind of things should we revisit and say, perhaps it has not been working as we had hoped, and maybe there's another way to approach this, because this is a fundamental interest of humanity. And we don't get the traction, I'm sorry to say, I don't think we get the traction that we should be getting.
I share your disappointment, devastation, I think, of what's happening in American universities. As a graduate of Yale Law School, I cannot imagine how I would be able to go back to the institute, although Yale, I think, was a little less the hall of shame as other Ivy League universities at present. In asking what more can be done, there is no simple answer to that, except for more and more engagement, except for approaching leadership, political leadership, media leadership, influencers, including Hollywood influencers. I'll just mention here, I'm in personal contact with Gal Gadot, for instance, who's totally being recruited to this battle, and of course she's not the only one. And as I said before, using the language of universal human rights, not putting it as an issue of Israel versus Palestine, but as an issue that should be of concern to all human rights advocates. And it's an uphill battle. There's no question about that. We did not yet say this evening the word anti-Semitism, and I really never imagined that in my adult life I would find myself having to admit that old anti-Semitism is still inherent in so many parts of the world and in so many people and leaders. But I'm afraid to say that we have to admit that it is also part of what we're facing now. And we know how difficult this battle is, but we have no choice but to engage in it if we want to survive and if we want the whole world to flourish and to overcome those dark powers of pure evil.
So I want to just thank you, because those are the ideals and the mission of FELNET. I think you really spoke endorsing actually what our mission is, and we are not giving up. We believe in the fight, and we are trying to garner as much support as we possibly can from our friends around the world. And this is just humanitarian interests. Yes, it is Israeli focused, but these are humanitarian interests. And thank you so much for your support and for your advocacy. And I joined FELNET because I like what their mission is. I like what we're doing. I know that there's a lot of work to do, but we're doing it. And hopefully we're doing it, and maybe it'll start speeding up and the message will go quicker. We're impatient, but we are making a lot of progress. And so thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you for doing all the work that you are doing.
Thank you, Tom. Dr. Halperin-Kaddari, I would like to really personally thank you for your sacrifice of doing what you do and sharing some of your experience on this horrific topic with us tonight. We understand it must take a big toll on your own emotional well-being to have to deal with such heavy matters, and therefore we really, really appreciate your presence today.